is the role of religion in our ever-changing world? From the News Channel 5 Network, this is Issues of Faith.
Welcome to Issues of Faith. Today we want to take a look at the history of Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is coming up, and there is a great deal of religious influence when it comes to this holiday. We're very happy to have with us somebody who can help us understand all of that. Dr. James P. Byrd, Associate Professor of American Religious History at Vanderbilt University. Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.
Very interesting topic. And I want to just kind of go through several points. I mean, when we think of Thanksgiving, we think of the Pilgrims and the black hat and that kind of thing. But what's the real story of that first Thanksgiving?
Well, that first Thanksgiving, I mean, there was a meal. I mean, there was a celebration in 1621 with the Pilgrims who had come here, who were trying to survive with the Wampanoags, together. And they did eat wild turkey, and they did have a feast, and they had a time together. But it didn't become an official holiday until 1863, when Abraham Lincoln made it so.
So that is, I think, what a lot of people might think. They think, okay, the Pilgrims did this, and then it just happened every year after that.
Right.
But so we had that first Thanksgiving. What happened after that, between that first Thanksgiving and when it became a holiday in the 1800s, during the Civil War?
Right.
What happened in that time frame?
There were a lot of Thanksgivings, but they were occasional. I mean, when something would happen that people were thankful for, they would have a day of Thanksgiving. So different colonies would proclaim Thanksgiving days or fast days when they were facing some challenge that they needed God's divine providence to help them with. So, they had Thanksgiving days, but they weren't in any way across all the colonies, and they weren't planned ahead of time.
And they weren't in November?
They weren't necessarily in November. They were all through the year, whenever they were needed.
So Thanksgiving as we know it, and you told me this, that's how I know this, it happened, it officially became Thanksgiving during the Civil War.
That's right.
How did that come about?
Well, it came about when Abraham Lincoln made it an official day for the nation to celebrate. It was in the middle of the Civil War. There was obviously division. I mean, the nation was divided. And there was a particular person, her name was Sarah Hale, and she was the editor of Godey's Lady Book. Now, I know you may never, that's not like a household name today, but it was then. It had a circulation of like 150,000 mid-19th century. And she was editor of that women's magazine for like 30 years or so more. And she was a Thanksgiving just fanatic. I mean, she loved Thanksgiving. She thought Thanksgiving should be a national holiday, and she lobbied politicians all the time, just kept lobbying politicians. And finally, Abraham Lincoln relented, saw the value in it, and made it national.
How did we come up with that day, the day that we now celebrate, the Thursday in November?
That's just the day that they decided on when they were thinking about harvest and Thanksgiving, and thinking about the original Thanksgiving, which they were remembering when they made this the national holiday. So that became the story that provided, as it still does, kind of the narrative or basis for the national holiday. So
how big a role does war play in Thanksgiving?
War was tremendously influential on Thanksgiving, because if we go to count up the Thanksgiving days, they were often in wartime. The American Revolution, for instance, was very prominent in terms of Thanksgiving. There were a lot of Thanksgivings during the American Revolution.
Meaning Washington, there would be more than one a year. Is that what you're saying?
Whenever needed, right.
So, okay, all right, that's interesting. So there'd be, during wartime in the American Revolution, George Washington liked the idea of Thanksgiving.
Right. And the first really kind of national Thanksgiving, well, it wasn't really a nation yet, but the Continental Congress established Thanksgiving days in the American Revolution. George Washington was a firm believer in giving thanks. George Washington was more of a deist. He wasn't really what we would call an evangelical, but he definitely believed in God, and he believed in God's providence. He believed in praying during the war. He wanted his soldiers to be very pious. He wanted them to be moral, because he needed God on his side against the British. So he liked chaplains, and he liked sermons to the soldiers, and he was really much in favor of the Thanksgiving day, because it was giving thanks to God for what God had done for them.
Going back to that first Thanksgiving with the Pilgrims, we have this idealized view of it. What was the reality of the situation?
Well, the reality of the situation was complex because, it certainly was, there was a time together, but as we know, the relationship between the Pilgrims and the Puritans, who were their close neighbors later, was very complex. And the relationship between them and the Native Americans was very complex. I mean, in just a few years, they were fighting wars with each other. So they had peace for a time, in large part because of the Wampanoag leader, Massasoit, who was the chief there, who was very peaceful. He wanted peaceful relations with the English, but that broke down over time. And we know that, and it was a tragic story, tragic history. So it's sort of bittersweet when we look back on it.
You look at what they had been through, right? The Pilgrims to that point. On some level, it is remarkable that they chose to give thanks.
Mm-hmm.
They had seen so many of the people around them die.
Right, right.
And it would be easy to be angry.
Right.
And instead they decide, okay, everybody has known loss.
Right.
Every one of them has probably had a relative die.
Exactly.
And they decide to give thanks, which is a remarkable reaction.
It is, but it was their reaction because of their belief in God and their belief in covenant. I mean, we don't talk that much about covenant anymore, but covenant was the basis for just about everything they did. They thought of marriage as a covenant. They thought of the state as a covenant. They thought of the church as a covenant. They thought of the relationship with them and God as a covenant, like a covenant of grace. So they thought about covenants, and all about covenant is a relationship. And they believed that the most amazing thing in the Bible was the notion of covenant, where God, who could do anything, set up covenants with them and set up covenants with people. So the basis of covenant is you try to be obedient, you try to honor the terms of the covenant or the contract, and you're thankful when God blesses you because you've done that.
So this is very much a religious holiday.
Very much. Very much it was.
And how do we miss that, do you think?
Well, I think that it's become secularized over the years for various reasons. I think when people think about Thanksgiving now, they think more about the food, they think about the family time and the celebration. And it has always been, in some ways, about food, and it has always been about family time, and in some ways about thankfulness and celebration. But before, it was much more solemn. I mean, it was really, when you think about thanks, it was thank you to God because they had survived, because they had gone through this ordeal. And so they were celebrating, but it was more of just a thankfulness to God, God's grace for what they had.
So Abraham Lincoln establishes this.
Right.
And how many holidays do we even have then? I mean, how remarkable or unusual is it for us to declare a day like that, for him to do that?
It's interesting in our world of Hallmark, and I think there's a holiday every 2 weeks now or something. They only had 2 national holidays at that time. There was Washington's birthday, which was most critical, and then there was the 4th of July.
So there were only 2.
There were 2, and then Thanksgiving became a national holiday.
The woman who pushed it did it come about initially as a religious holiday, or did it come about as something else? I mean, I guess the woman you mentioned who pushed this, how did she get it done? She
wanted a holiday for women. Now, I know a lot of women will laugh at that because it's hardly a holiday for a lot of women, and it really wasn't then, but she wanted something that would emphasize the home and the importance of the family. And at this time, in the 19th century, I mean, we just have to imagine things were going crazy. I mean, things were different. I mean, a lot of us have read that story, Rip Van Winkle, Washington Irving, where Rip goes to sleep and sleeps for 20 years, gets up, and the world's changed. People could relate to that because it felt like the world had changed overnight. And that's why that story had such resonance. I mean, everything was changing. People were moving and making their way. I mean, people were moving to the forming cities. People were striking out on their own after the revolution because they had this idea of liberty, that they had the power and the liberty to do whatever they wanted to do. And that came with a lot of problems. Like alcohol was a major problem.
Right.
People were moving to the cities. Young people were out on their own, making their own way, losing touch with family. More and more people weren't working at home anymore. It wasn't like the family farm anymore where men were working at home. They were going into the cities to work and that kind of thing. So, alcohol consumption in like 1830 was like whiskey consumption was like 5 gallons per person. you know, which was an amazing amount. I mean, people from other countries couldn't believe how much people in the United States were drinking.
That is astounding. And so that is the backdrop at which we decide, okay, let's have Thanksgiving. The Civil War, the dramatically changing culture,
right,
and then the notion that it's a holiday for women, when women couldn't even vote, right?
Right, right. So yeah, it was a way for women to be acknowledged, in some way bringing people back, because women became the heads of the households during this time, in the sense that men were so often gone, so often working. It became the woman's job most often to raise the children, to discipline the children, to make sure everyone kind of be the religious leader of the family. And that had always been men before, often had been men before, like in Puritan New England. But now women had taken on that role because of the changes in the economy, the changes in society.
All right, we need to take a break. Then I want to come back and talk about the Protestant nature of the holiday.
Sure.
Lots to talk about there. So we'll take a break, be back right after this.